your flesh and blood.
Welcome to Tell Me Your Story, New Paradigms for a New World. I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and it's always a pleasure to come your way with the topics and guests to help give you choices and knowledge of those choices, help you find those new ways of living, and help to make your dreams come true. We're here to share with you some interesting ideas. And when I say we, I mean I and the guests that we have on the program. And today is no exception. We're going to get more information from our guest than there we are from me. We're going to be talking with the author of Dear Younger Me, Wisdom for Family Enterprise Successors. David Bentall is my guest. David, welcome to Tell Me Your Story. It's really nice to have you with us.
Richard, thanks so much. Looking forward to sharing some of my life and my story. Appreciate it.
And for those of you who are not watching the YouTube video, which is available on the YouTube channel Richard Dugan, he's wearing a tie, and I would say, I suppose you're a little overdressed for this program. We don't require a suit and tie or anything, but you know what? You come as you are.
Richard, if I can just interrupt, I taught at the university for 7 years, and I think I was the only professor still on campus wearing a tie. I've got them all hanging in my closet. I like wearing them, so thank you for acknowledging that I at least have it on.
Well, I have to say that I can't remember the last time I wore a tie. I have several. Matter of fact, I have one or two, maybe three of the deadhead neckties.
Yeah.
I was given a few of those over the years. But again, as I said, I don't wear them, but that's okay. I don't have to wear them. But what we do want to do is help people to wear a better countenance, if you will, when it comes to business, when it comes to our entrepreneurial and enterprise efforts, business and so forth. But I think that it also carries over into everyday life as well, even relationships. Not that I don't think anybody wants to turn their relationship into a business or an entrepreneurial venture. I don't think that would go over too well with the gals, especially.
Richard, I'm so glad you talk about the bleeding in between business and relationship, because my most recent book, which you've alluded to, is all about the relationships in business and how we can be better in those relationships. So we're on the same page. Yeah,
absolutely. And the fact of the matter is that I remember, first of all, I am not a traditional salesperson. Now, the irony is my father has said on many occasions that I could sell ice cubes to Eskimos. No offense to Eskimos. And yet, one of my first sales jobs was as a paper boy when I was a kid growing up. And I was a paper boy for probably 5 years, 8th grade all the way through high school. I went on many trips to Disneyland. I have many awards for high sales and so forth, though I didn't think about it at the time and going, wow, I'm really good at sales. I should go into sales. And then I go into college and, pursued the general stuff in junior college. Went to vocational school, moved to Santa Barbara and went to work for a company that sold over the phone, and it was incoming calls, thank goodness. It was called Bargain Network. It's no longer in business. What they did was sell this $29.95 a month catalog for, initially it was for cars, and then they shifted over into real estate or homes. And I had a real hard time with that, and yet I have the paperwork to prove it. I was also another one of those top sellers.
Awesome.
And I hated it. I hated the job, But
you were still good at it.
But when I went to work for a radio station, they brought me in through the sales department. One of the things that they talked about was what we're going to talk about. They said that when you are going out cold calling, you're going to a company, a business, what have you, this is not about getting the signature on the contract and a check. That is not what it's about. It's about building relationships. And I'm going, that seems really disingenuous, because the goal is to get the signature on the contract and a check to keep the radio station going. But ever since I moved to Santa Barbara, and I'm not in sales here, I'm the operations manager, my supervisor, my boss, the general manager, he handles the sales predominantly. But I'm part of his sales team in terms of production, and I relate to the customer, the client, the advertiser, the programmer, on a level that is very friendly, very amenable. I never like to say, no, we can't do that. I'll say, hey, let me look into it. Let me see what we can do. And quite honestly, if we can't, I'll say, well, here's the reason why. But maybe there's an alternative. And I've always thought of that there's always a backup plan, like in computers, there's always a workaround. There's always a workaround.
It's so interesting, Richard, you talk about being genuine. My father told me that you couldn't trust salespeople. And yet 4 separate people told me they thought he was the best salesman that they'd ever met.
Wow.
And I think Richard, the reason you were successful in sales, my dad, is because you're genuine. If you genuinely care about somebody, you try and help them get what's good for them. And often that may be what you're trying to offer. So,
well, I think that one of the things that did help me, in spite of the conscious awareness in terms of my dislike of sales, because I'm trying to sell somebody something that, maybe they don't really need, let alone don't want. And that goes to this with our programmers. My goal is not to be successful. My goal is to make the client, the advertiser, the programmer successful, and in turn, I am successful.
Yeah.
Is that lost in today's world? Because it appears that we seem to be going backwards in time to the bottom line being the most important thing.
Well, I think it is lost in a lot of people these days. I'm not negative about our society or our world. We've got lots of problems, but I think it is lost often because we're taught, especially in North America, we're taught about our own. What do our parents want us to do? Grow up, get a job, and go become independent. What is that about? It's about looking after, number one, looking after ourselves. And I think if we can have a little more grace and think about other people a little more, we're going to be better salespeople. We're going to create a better world. So I actually think it has been lost a bit, but let's work on doing our part, Richard, to see if we can encourage folks to get past that perspective.
Yeah. Well, you put this book together, and it's not a thick book, but it's hefty, by comparison. Obviously, you spared, in a manner of speaking, no expense or moderate, with glossy, thick paper. I don't know what the measurements are for the different sizes of paper, but nonetheless, it's a nice paperback, and it's a little oversized, but it gives
intended to be a workbook rather than a coffee table book. We want people to use it, to take it like a trusty sword into battle when they get up every morning.
And I like I don't know who chooses coloring for diagrams and graphs and things of this nature, but the colors chosen here, the blue and the brown, I know there's names for those, I'm sure, I think they work really well in the context because they're not blaring, but they give you just enough standout.
Yeah.
But you talk about these 9 character traits to transform your leadership. Now, I won't go into detail as to my original, one of my leadership styles, other suffice it to say that I used to describe it as my Hitlerian form of management. You will do this because I said to do this.
Das ist gut, yeah.
Das is not good, because one of my coworkers, and I never referred to them as employees, they were always coworkers. He wouldn't do what I was asking because I was asking.
Right.
So I rephrased it. And when I rephrased it, he said, okay, I will do it now. And so what I learned very early on was, don't throw your weight around. You don't have any. I don't care who you are. You're expendable. You can be replaced. Maybe not with as good a person, but you can still be replaced. Or in some instances, you are not going to be replaced. They're just going to say, you know what, we'll just do without. That seems to have happened over the years in businesses in particular, where they've decided that no, we'll just give some of these tasks to the existing employees. We'll have them take care of it, So now the existing employees, now they're overloaded with all of these other tasks that maybe on the one hand, they weren't hired. This wasn't part of their job description, but it is now. And the pressures on that individual to not just be productive, but to provide quality productivity. Is there an issue in that regard? Then we're going to get into these 9 characteristics.
Well, I think that we are all being asked to do more with less, and we've seen through COVID, lots of companies have had to make radical adjustments. And I think if I look at my own personal circumstance during COVID, I worked longer hours than I've ever worked in order to earn less. Right, so I think that there's a lot of us are being stretched, Richard. I think that's a common challenge that we're facing in our corporation.
Do you think that any of the corporations are learning anything from this process in terms of realizing that it isn't the CEO or the vice president or anybody else at the top of the pyramid that is really making the money, the bottom line for the company, that it's actually the people at the bottom of the pyramid, and that we need to show them more respect, more consideration? I've often said that the pyramid, the pay structure stays right side up, but the pyramid needs to be flipped upside down. And it's the workers that should be making the big bucks, not the CEOs.
Well, it's interesting. People talk also about flipping the organization chart upside down and putting the employees at the top because they are the most important, and the CEO should be serving them. And I think that we could use a lot more organizations that think that way. And I'm not sure you get very far trying to turn the compensation upside down, but I think that our compensation structures in North America, by and large, have ended up being way too top heavy. So there's room for us to figure some things out there, Richard, for sure. But that we get back to COVID. I think some of our corporations have learned that there are people who've been hiding, and I think so that there have been a lot of people who've been sadly sidelined because they were able to hide. Now that people are taking a close look at things, I think in the next several years, people are going to have to really show how they add value, and hopefully those who are adding value are the ones who are going to get retained and paid properly.
I'll touch on one other element before we jump into these 9 character traits. The population is constantly getting older and older. I'm 62.
67.
I'm in an industry that I could work as long as I want to work, especially in the context, let's say if I was able to find an investor or some financing or some network that would be willing to pay me to do these podcasts or broadcasts, because they are actually broadcast, podcast, videocasts. I love doing them. I absolutely love doing them. And I'm 62, but there are other industries where you start getting up into the senior years, and because your health may not be optimal, it's going to cost a little bit more for medical care and those kinds of things. And, we could hire someone, we could hire 2 or 3 people for the salary we're paying you, but they won't have the level of quality and experience and knowledge and wisdom for these positions. What about that aspect? Because nowadays there are 2 phrases for the elderly that are starting to be thrown at the employer to force them not to move people around. One of them is age discrimination. I've heard it said that the only way you can declare that is if they hire someone who's younger than you. But someone brought this one up, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong. But if they're trying to get rid of you and they're now nitpicking at all of your mistakes, could that not be construed as elder abuse?
Well, I think it sure could be. But, I'm excited about what's happening, because I think that as health has been, as our health has improved, generally speaking, we have a chance to keep working much longer. And I'm excited. Richard, you're in a career and I'm in a career. Both of us, God willing, can keep doing this for a long time. And I actually think that people are prepared to pay for wisdom and experience. And so I'm looking forward to a frontier, which doesn't mean I drop off the face of the earth of 65. And, I was talking to our children last night. God willing, I'd like to be doing some form of work for a long time yet to come. So I think that there's a great future for us, Richard, where we can maybe work a little bit less, but work a lot longer in terms of the years we have a chance to be productive.
Yeah. Well, I jokingly, but it may happen. I don't know. I first of all have plans to live to be 100.
Good for
Great
you.
grandmother, my great grandmother, lived to be 100, and when she was in her 90s, I used to say that I was going to outlive her, but she's making it really hard. Not that I wanted her to die. Don't get me wrong. Um, but that they would have to peel my cold dead carcass off the console,
Yeah.
which is not a pretty thing if you consider the person coming in behind me having to peel my cold dead carcass off the console.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, my grandpa made it to 94, and my mother-in-law is living with us. She's 95, and so I'm hoping to beat their record. I told my wife that I'm likely to outlive her, given that my dad outlived his wife and my grandpa outlived his wife. And my wife said to me, "You're not getting rid of me that easily." She said. So we're going to see who can make it the longest.
There you go. It's a race.
It's a race.
Yeah, my dad's 91. He's been retired for many years. And I want to actually ask both my parents. My dad will be 92 this year, next year, 2023. Mother 89. And they're both very vibrant still. But the one question that I want to ask them that I kind of want to kind of put to the senior set out there is, if you're not working, if you're not, if there's nothing really in particular that you're doing, what is it that gets you out of bed every morning?
Yeah. I think it has to be more than a golf ball.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
I'm not a golfer. I've
I'm not
taken
a golfer.
one lesson, and supposedly I'm pretty good at that one lesson. But who knows? I may be horrible on the green. On the putting green. David Bentall is my guest, and we are talking about Dear Younger Me. It is Wisdom for Family Enterprise Successors. And as we continue, we're going to talk about the 9 character traits to transform your leadership as we continue here on Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and it's a pleasure to have David Bentall on the program here to talk about his latest work, which is, of course, Dear Younger Me. He has a website that we will be linked to, ladies and gentlemen, and we want you to go there to find out more about him as well as the work that he is doing. The website is nextstepadvisors.ca. That's Next Step Advisors, all one word, .ca. We hope that you'll find him that way. He is, of course, on LinkedIn and Twitter and YouTube and all kinds of other places. Let's talk about these 9 character traits. First of all, how did you come to sift down to just 9?
Well, it's interesting, Richard. Maybe I should start by how I even got 9 to begin with.
Yeah, okay. That's a good idea.
After I worked in our family companies for 20 years, and my grandpa started a company that resulted in him being honored to be inducted into the Canadian Business Hall of Fame. My dad helped build the business, so it was voted one of the 100 best companies to work for in Canada. So I wanted to follow my dad and my grandpa in our family business. And sadly, things didn't work out that well. And after 20 years in the family business, everything got sold, and I've spent the last 25 years working with other families. And one day, Richard, I was on my way home from having 2 separate family meetings, one in the province of Saskatchewan, one in the province of Alberta. And Richard, I'd prepared really well for the meetings, but they hadn't gone very well. And I was scratching my head. So I have no hair anymore. I was scratching my head trying to think, like, what went wrong? And I thought, the first meeting, one of the kids, one of the next gens, one of the up and comers in the business, like me, like I had been, he was impatient. He was 25. His dad was 55. He wanted to take over the company, wanted his dad to leave, and he was impatient. And that was causing problems in that family. And I thought, well, that was it was his impatience. And then I thought, well, the other meeting didn't go very well either. What was that? I thought, oh gosh, one member of the family, he wouldn't forgive his dad. And that was causing tension in the family. And I thought, I'm sure glad when I was working in our family company that I was not like that. Or was I? And I began to realize I lacked patience and I lacked forgiveness in my own relationships in our family and in our business. And Richard, I grabbed a scrap of paper and I started listing what other ways had I been unhelpful. And pretty soon I lacked humility. I lacked curiosity. I never listened to anybody else. I figured they should listen to me. I lacked empathy. I lacked gratitude. And I kept going. I lacked critical thinking skills. I lacked contentment. And so I got it to 10. That felt like too many. So but I really got there, Richard, by looking at my own life and then comparing it with the 25 years I've spent advising other families. And I think that these 9 traits that I've written about are commonly lacking in family enterprise successors. So it was really a reflection, looking in the mirror, frankly, that I got the list. What David did wrong, how I could have been different. So that's hence the title, Dear Younger Me.
I know too that it has been repeated over and over again in current times that we need to look differently at the concept of failure. Now, I would personally prefer to eliminate the words success and failure and rephrase them as life lessons or learning experiences, because that's what, again, I'll use the word anyway, that's what failures are. They're learning lessons. And of course, this example has been used almost to death, beating a dead horse. And that is the one with Thomas Edison and the light bulb. And he was asked how many times he failed. And he said, I never failed. I just found 990 ways that the light bulb didn't work.
Yeah.
And he just kept at it.
Well, and you remind me of one of my heroes. Einstein had a similar take on life. And, we all regard Einstein perhaps as the quintessential brainiac. But, he said, and he thought about his own life. He said, I'm not particularly brilliant. He said, I don't have any special gifts. I'm just incredibly curious. And I think that what I'm hearing in that, Richard, is that here's a man who obviously was gifted, but he brought curiosity to the table, and he wasn't worried about failing. He was wanting to keep trying and learning from his experience. So I like your idea. I'm a competitive water skier by avocation, and my coach says that we need to treat success and failure both as the imposters that they are. Both are imposters. Success is really not what we think it is, and failure is not what we think it is. They're both just tries, and we need to keep learning from each. So I'm 100% with you that it'd be good to get rid of those words in our vocabulary.
Yeah. We're talking right now here with David Bentall, and we're discussing this whole aspect of leadership characteristics, these 9 character traits. Let's talk about these. Let's knock out the first 3 here.
Humility, curiosity, and listening. I like to group those, Richard, under the banner of connection. They're all about building connection. Earlier on in the broadcast, you talked about building better relationships and how important that is. One of the reasons I wrote Dear Younger Me is if we're going to work, primarily my clients work in family businesses, but whether we're in a family business or whether we're just in a family, or whether we just have a group of friends we want to get along with, our connections with them, our interpersonal relationships with them will be greatly enhanced if we can learn humility, curiosity, and listening skills. And why did I learn that? It's because I always had the right idea. Don't listen. I wasn't going to listen to you because I wanted to tell you. And so that's why one of the reasons why I no longer work for our family company, because I came in running around telling everybody what to do. And I think, if I can quote Mark Twain, he said, wisdom is the reward you get for a lifetime of listening when you'd rather have talked. And it takes humility to become like that. It takes curiosity to be like that. And so I've been working on cultivating humility, curiosity, and listening in my own life. And Richard, can I just add how that relates to business for a moment? Because,
Please.
You tend to, we were talking about relationships. Of course, these things can help in our relationships. But, how did Michelin Tire become a household name around the world? Well, Edouard Michelin, who was the head of the company in a previous century, he was a man who led by humility. And what do I mean by that? He would walk around and ask his employees what they were up to, and he paid attention. You talk about the upside down pyramid. He was paying attention. And one day he noticed that one of the guys in his print shop, not even working in R&D or tire manufacturing, in the print shop, had some strange object on his desk, and he asked the kid what it was, and the guy explained, and he said, young man, you've got a really good idea here. I'd like to have you in our R&D department. And that young man, who he moved into the R&D department, invented the radial tire, which became, the centerpiece of Michelin Tire's global strategy. And it came because Edouard Michelin was willing to be humble enough to ask this young guy in the typesetting department, what are you doing? And so I think actually humility is not just good for relationships. It can actually be fantastically helpful in getting ideas and flowing them up the organization chart and implemented so organizations can grow and satisfy their customers, as you and I were talking about earlier.
How do you balance the humility, though, with the personal recognition of your abilities, capabilities, aptitudes, and, for example, being able to say, still with humility, I'm good at what I do?
Richard, I don't think we have to ever say that. I think we need to take our eyes off ourselves. And that's what humility is. I'm quoting again, if I may, briefly from C.S. Lewis. He says, true humility is not thinking less of yourself, not putting yourself down. It's just thinking of yourself less. And as you talk about making proposals to and working with your broadcasters and various things, I, as an advisor to families, I spend very little time talking about what I can do for them and try and focus on what they need. And notice how that's the curiosity and listening lives right beside humility. If I can work with our clients, this morning I was on the phone with a gentleman who's got a successful construction business. 2 of his boys are working with him. And I said, how would you like to help your boys? He said, I got 2 things I want. I want to help them grow their self-esteem, and I want to help them learn how to, in the future, be able to manage our business. So, okay, so how do you want to do that? And he said, well, I think they need some coaching. And I said, well, gee, as a firm, we provide coaching. Would that be helpful? You notice that 90% of that short little conversation I've summarized was about, what are you looking for? What do your boys need? What do you want? And I said, well, we might be able to help you with that. And the focus was on him. And I think humility is about thinking less of ourselves. So we don't have to talk about how good we are. We need to talk about what do people need and then try and satisfy their needs if we can. That's my perspective on it, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Oh no, it makes perfect sense. And the interesting thing is we've got so many examples of just the reverse. I did this and I did this and I can do that and I can solve, and on and on and on. And
do you know where that comes from? That comes from insecurity most of the time. Mm-hmm. At least it did for me. I was wanting to tell everybody how good I was because I didn't want them to find out that I didn't know everything.
Yeah. Well, I have to say that it is thousands of people who are responsible for me being here talking with you. I didn't get here on my own.
Right.
I recognize that. And that wherever I'm headed, I will get there because of the people around me today who have been here supporting me. And a matter of fact, there's one woman, oh my gosh, going back a good 30, 35 years. She's probably since passed on. Back in Phoenix, where I was born and raised, a woman by the name of Margaret Pekarik suggested to me in a very educator-like way, and it was good. It was a good thing.
She was mentoring you, yeah?
She was mentoring. She says, I think that you would benefit from joining Toastmasters.
Nice.
So I did. I got to tell you, I had a blast. It was fun.
Yeah.
Good
for you.
And so I thank her for that recommendation. I'm involved in a theatrical presentation here in Santa Barbara. I wish my other mentor, who was very much involved in radio and television and theater, she was actually my acting coach. It's funny too, because the relationship that I was in back then, she knew the dynamics thereof, would never let me do a romantic or love scene with anybody. But I still had a great time getting to know the people, and with the people I'm working with now on stage and the singing and the acting and then those kinds of things. The longer you're together, the more you become a family, but you also recognize, maybe this is a good example or a good analogy. You recognize not only how important your role is, but how important your role is to them. They need you as much as you need them.
Yeah. Richard, I'm just so touched by the fact that you picked up 2 folks who mentored you. You and I are in our 60s now. I don't meet a lot of folks in their 60s who are willing to admit that they needed a mentor or they had someone to mentor them. And I think in the next generation, we don't have enough folks looking for mentors. One of my mentors has told me that he thinks we all should have at least 5 mentors.
Oh, wow.
And that's why, as a result of writing this book, we developed not just the 9 traits as things that people should learn. We've actually, Richard, during COVID, developed a mentoring and coaching program so that if any of our listeners are wanting to learn how to cultivate these traits, we're not going to just slap a book on their desk and say, read it and do it. But we've developed a mentoring and coaching program so that we can help people to learn how to cultivate these traits, because we don't get to do these things on our own. We need help. We need coaching. So good for you.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. Absolutely. Dear younger me, David Bentall is my guest, and you are listening to Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and we are talking about these 9 character traits in terms of your leadership skills and abilities, not just on the home front, but in your business as well. Yeah. One of the things that I'm finding interesting that I have run into over the years in my career is how much of a family most of the jobs I have become, including the one I'm at right now, where the longer you're there, and I have to tell you that up until 2 years ago, a job that I had at a Christian radio station was the longest job I had ever stayed at, 15 years.
Wonderful.
Now, this job I've been at for almost 17 years. And it certainly breaks the mold of what I was told in broadcast school about be prepared to be moving around, because you'll be moving around a lot from radio station to radio station all over the country. And I'm thinking, I don't want to do that.
Yeah.
Not if I can help it anyway.
Richard, you're showing loyalty. You know, that's a scarce commodity today. Yeah. 15 years, 17 years. We don't have, my dad actually took a salary from our family company for 50 years, 50, 1938 to 1988. And when my sisters and I bought the company, if I can poke fun at my dad, we said, you've taken a salary for 50 years. Your kids now own the business. We're cutting you off. You've been paid for 50 years long enough. So we stopped. But he came to the office for another 10 years, little shorter days, but 17 years, 15 years. That's good longevity, Richard. Today, it's awesome.
Yeah, and I mean, I've been doing this for 43 years. I remember my father, who does not like me to refer to him as a wise person, but he is, at least to me. And he said to me once, he says, find a job you love doing because you're going to be doing it a long time. But then he ended the statement by saying, don't get stuck like me. But my father didn't get stuck. He went back to junior college and he got his computer programming degree, where back then in the 70s, they were using fanfold paper and punch cards. You know, so that last part, I find rather interesting. But be that as it may, I've always felt that I've been in the right place at the right time, whether it be paperboy, delivering newspapers, which, by the way, even at 62, if the job were still available, okay,
you'd do it again?
I would absolutely do it again. Because it really isn't that much different than this job and doing these interviews. I got to meet some incredible people, have great conversations with them, and run a business.
Yeah. And you're sharing news, you're sharing information. So,
yeah.
I wanted to be a fireman when I was a kid.
Really?
And one of my friends, so much so that I screamed and threw a bit of a tantrum when I was 10 because my mom and dad were going to buy a blue Pontiac Parisienne for her, and they decided. I said I wanted the red one, so I wanted to have our own fire truck, so they bought the red. I know I was a bit of a spoiled brat, but they agreed to buy the red one. But our family was in real estate and construction, and Dad knew I wanted to be a fireman. So when we bought a fire hall and actually tore it down to build a shopping center, unbeknownst to me, Dad had the fire pole put on a truck, flatbed truck, brought over to our home. We had a little forest out behind our property, and he had some of our carpenters build a tree fort. And as a kid, all the friends in the neighborhood would come and we'd play on the. We had a real fireman's fire pole. And the reason I mention that is that I always wanted to be a fireman, and I'd forgotten all about it until a few years ago. And someone said, "David, you're getting to live your dream now." And I said, "No, I'm not. I'm a family enterprise advisor." What do family enterprise advisors do? You help protect families' businesses, you help protect their lives.
Yeah.
That's what a fireman does. And so I now try and help families to protect their assets, not with a hose, but hopefully with a little bit of wisdom, as you say, your dad tries to share.
Yeah. The other part of my father that is only slightly disheartening, and I called him not too long ago to share this with him. he would be sharing with me and the other kids too. And I come from a family of 6 kids, 4 sisters, 2 brothers, 1 brother, myself obviously, and then my parents. And my father would say, and he said this in his 90s. He would say when we would talk about, being raised and being taught this and that, and the other, well, your mother gets all the credit for that. I really didn't have anything to do with that. So I called him one day after watching this wonderful movie called I Can Only Imagine.
Yeah,
I think it's the title of the movie.
The guys who wrote Dear Younger Me. I named my book after the Mercy Me. They wrote Dear Younger Me. Yeah.
Yeah. And after watching that movie, I called him up and I said, Dad, I just want you to know that in spite of the fact that you don't feel like you had any impact and influence on our lives and on my life in particular, I want you to know I wouldn't be half the man I am if it weren't for you.
Good for you.
And I love you very much. And you had as big a role in influencing us as Mom did, and again, not to take anything away from my mother, because she brought us into this world, and there were times when she wanted to take us out.
Well, Richard, you and I have something in common, because it sounds to me, as you've spoken tenderly about your father being offering you wisdom, and you wouldn't be half the man you are if it wasn't for his influence. My dad was one of my heroes too, and I'm so grateful that you and I have in common men who we can look up to. And I strive to be that kind of person for our 4 kids, and now for our 9 grandkids. I want them to be. Yeah, we're very blessed with 9, and we're trusting God for more. So we are so blessed, and to have fathers like that. And I want to be the kind of man that our kids can look up to. But that brings us back to these ideas. If I can cultivate these kind of character traits, it's going to make a difference, not just in my business and not just in my personal life, but also in my family life.
We're talking with David Bentall. His book is Dear Younger Me, and we'll give out that website in just a moment as we continue here on Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, your host, and we're having a really fascinating conversation here with David Bentall, who has written a book called Dear Younger Me, and we started out with the first 3 traits, character traits of humility. I'm remembering 2 of them: humility and listening. What was the middle one?
Curiosity.
Curiosity. Knew there was one with the C.
Yeah.
And that's where I'm at too, is that level of curiosity. I've always been curious, but I've also used the logical part of my brain in that curiosity to not necessarily always question authority, but to question the answers that I would receive when the answers I was receiving did not make any sense. I mean, that, especially working for the Christian radio station and listening to a lot of the commentary of a spiritual life, it was just fascinating. It's like, wait a minute, that doesn't make any sense. That is one specific I'll give you. Paul says in the epistles, he says, "It is appointed every man once to die, and then the judgment," right? Okay, so now you better explain to me Lazarus. Okay, explain it to me, Lucy. I don't understand. How is it that Paul says it's for every man once to die, but Lazarus, according to the gospel, died twice? Now, what is death? What is the definition of death in those times? Because we can't really use our definition today, because we have all these great machines and diagnostic tools, and now I know the heart stopped, but there's still brain activity, so they're still alive. It's like, okay, so then there's one other that I'll throw out there that doesn't make any sense.
And by the way, on Lazarus,
Yes.
I'm gonna guess that Paul might have put a little if he had time, he might have put a little footnote and said, except for Lazarus, he's an exception.
Yeah, he probably would have. The other part of it is Adam and Eve.
Yeah.
We started out with one human being, and then we got two. There is absolutely nothing in the book of Genesis that tells us beyond Cain and Abel who came next. So the conclusion, and again, I mean no disrespect.
It was Lucy and Mary. Don't you know anything, Rich?
Well, here's the thing, and I mean no disrespect, okay? But here's the conclusion. What they did back then to propagate the species, today we call incest. I mean, there's no other logical explanation. Yeah. Well, and I know that's offensive.
Well, no, but I think you're trying to point out some logic. And, our son has a PhD in Old Testament studies. So you're talking to a guy whose son knows a lot about the topic you're embarking on. And our son, John, has helped me a lot because he said, most of us make a big mistake. If we dare to open the Bible, most of us make a big mistake. And that is that we bring our modern mind to it rather than submitting to it.
Mm-hmm.
And he said, our minds are confused as we look at it, so don't let it speak to us. And he said, what we're better to do is take a look at this book in the world within which it was written,
and
understand it in its context.
Yeah.
But he said we also need to look at the world behind it. What is the world that gave rise to it? So we look at the world that it's in and the world behind it. But he said we need to also take a look at, or be aware of the world that's in front of it. Yeah. And the world that's in front of it's the world we're in. And he said if we can step past that and come to it and submit to it, we'll find that some of it's poetry.
Yeah.
Some of it's history.
Yeah.
Some of it's letters. And so, I grew up in a Christian home, and I believe that the Bible is a message from God for all of us.
Yeah.
Do I have trouble with it from time to time? Yeah. You know what my biggest trouble with it is, Richard? It asks me to do things I don't want to do. And you know what's so inconvenient is that if it's God's message, maybe I should be a little more about submitting rather than questioning. But I respect you for wanting to ask genuine questions. Like I don't think God's in favor of incest, so there's a logical problem. I get the problem.
Yeah, yeah. And I had a couple on talking about marriage, and I said, okay, so we can conclude based upon the information that we have that the first marriage was between Adam and Eve. Who officiated? Who sanctioned it? All right. Where's the marriage license? Did they have blood tests, etc.? I mean, I get facetious, but and that kind of thing. And it's like, okay, there was no officiant. I mean, oh well, God officiated. Well, all right, fine. But there are people who get together today. They may or may not have a ceremony, but they're committed, and they will. And many of them, they live and then they die together, and so forth. So anyway, but we'll leave that for another conversation. But
I'd be happy to pick it up another day.
Pick it up another day.
Really good questions.
But I think that's fantastic that you and your son have that kind of conversation, and that he's got that level. I've had rabbis on this program who we've talked about these kinds of things, and the one thing that they have always they love to talk to me about is that one word. Context. Do you know the context in which this particular law was written or that particular law was written? What was going on in that day that required 613 laws, before the 10 Commandments and so forth? So I absolutely love those kinds of conversations. I want to touch upon three more of these character traits.
Yeah.
And we'll do that as we continue talking with David Bentall here on Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, your host. And what are the next set of three that we can talk about here after we have already discussed humility, curiosity, and listening?
Good for you. So the next three I'd like to talk a little bit about, Richard, are empathy, gratitude, and forgiveness. And those I loosely group around compassion. If we are compassionate with others, we will be more empathetic and more forgiving towards them. If we're compassionate with ourselves, we'll be more grateful and less hard on ourselves as we think about our own lives. And I want to start with forgiveness, because we've been talking about what does the Bible have to say about this and about that. You know, one of my clients was really interesting. We were talking about forgiveness and business. And she said to me, you know, business is supposed to be about spreadsheets and marketing plans, not forgiveness. And I said, are you saying it's irrelevant? She said, no. She said, I've discovered that if you're going to have anything that works in a business, you need people. And people are messy. And if you got messy people, you're going to need to have forgiveness. And I thought that was such a lovely insight, because what I've written about, Richard, is how important it is, not just in our personal relationships, but even in our professional relationships. What if one of your colleagues forgets to meet a deadline or forgets to deliver something? We need to forgive one another, or else we just cut off every relationship. Then what have we got?
Yeah.
And so to have sustained, you know, I've been married 44 years. Gosh, my wife and I have had lots of practice at forgiveness, because we've hurt each other, we've disappointed each other. And so if we're thinking now to entrepreneurs who are listening, if we're going to have relationships that are going to work, we need to forgive. And, you know, Thomas Watson, former head of IBM, I don't know if you remember the famous story, but he had one of his salespeople came back and had failed to land $1 million contract, which back in the pre-war days was just post-war days was a very big contract. And he put his letter of resignation on the table to Mr. Watson, said, I'm sorry, I failed to get the contract, and here's my letter of resignation. And Mr. Watson ripped it up, and he said, having invested in your education, I want to have you stay with us. And he didn't use the word forgiveness, but practically speaking, he forgave that salesperson and said, as you said before, what is success? What is failure? That was a success because that young man learned a powerful lesson and stayed with the organization. So one thing we need to in our businesses is to be more forgiving. And empathy, let's just talk about that for a sec. You know, some of our listeners will know of Slack Technologies, a leading technology company headquartered in San Francisco, but I'm from Vancouver. They have an office in Vancouver. And the co-founder, Stuart Butterfield from Slack Technology, now CEO, he said that their number one value is empathy. Well, that was a bit curious to me. Most people talk about quality or service. He said empathy. And as he was interviewed, he said empathy, and as they define it, is noticing and paying attention to others. And he talks about it as tipping their umbrella. And I'll just, because I'm from Vancouver, I loved his story. He said, David, in Vancouver, we know it rains. And what happens when it rains? People pull out their umbrellas. And he said one day he was walking for lunch, and people were walking the other way, and they all had their umbrellas, and they were all at risk of poking each other in the eye because the sidewalk was narrow. And he said the people who had empathy took a moment to notice the others and tip their umbrella as they walked by. And Richard, it doesn't take a lot to show someone else that you're paying attention. And so empathy is one of the things that as a young man, my uncle had waited 30 years to become president. And I joined the family company when my uncle was 55, and I started talking to him about potentially being able to be prepared to leave the company in 10 years. That upset him because he'd waited 30 and I was thinking I only had to wait 10 to become the next president. Richard, if I had just a modicum of empathy, I would have realized that me just talking about such a rapid ascension to the top position would offend him, and I didn't understand why he was so upset. So empathy was something I was badly lacking. And the last one in this little cluster, forgiveness, empathy, gratitude. Richard, you talked about how important it is for us to think about those we work with and how those we work with have helped us to get a job at the radio station or whatever. And one of my favorite speakers, a fellow by the name of Tim Keller from New York, he said, you skeptical New Yorkers, he said, you think that you sitting in front of me here that you all have been self-made men or women. He said, you've all been to those Ivy League schools and you've worked hard on Wall Street and you've earned all this money. He said, If you were born in Tibet in the 13th century, Wall Street didn't exist, and they had no Ivy League schools, would you be sitting in front of me now today with your Mercedes and with your Rolex watch? And he said, you think you're a self-made man or woman? You need to be grateful that you were born when and where you were. And just to conclude that, for me, advising many families in business that I do, many of the next gen kids coming up in a family enterprise think that the world owes them a living, rather than taking the attitude that I want to cultivate in myself and that I encourage my clients to cultivate, to be thankful that we're born where we were and at the time we are. And so these are three of the things, Richard, I think that I missed badly in my life. And so I want to encourage family business leaders, family business successors to pursue empathy, gratitude, and forgiveness. Does that make any sense?
It absolutely does make sense. And it also, I think, raises an issue that I didn't personally deal with, but that I observed in 2008, 2009, but also more recently with obviously the country shutdown of the last two and a half years or so. And that is especially back 2008, 2009, when hundreds of thousands of people lost their jobs due to, I don't know what you call it, but it was an economic downturn.
Let's just call it what it is. Policy decision making related to COVID. That's fine.
Yeah. I'm talking 2008, 2009.
Well, back
that far. And these thousands of people lost their jobs. And one of the first things that came to my mind was, I wonder, and this deals with more metaphysical constructs of karma, how many of these people hated their jobs? They didn't like them. For example, those individuals who were working in a family business, that my dad did this and his grandfather, his father, and his father, and his father. And so I've got to do this. I don't really want to, but it's expected of me, and da-da-da-da-da. And now they've got to go out and figure out what they're going to do with their lives. And then entrepreneurialism exploded in 2009-10. It was incredible. And when you think about that, go back 100 years to the people who came through Ellis Island, and they started these little mom and pop businesses that 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, 80 years later are major national and international corporations doing business globally that started out as a mom and pop venture. Yeah. And it's like, you have no idea what's going to happen. But when the adversity comes along, which we'll call it a challenge, what are you going to do? What are you going to do? And for me, for example, when my wife and I lost our jobs back in Phoenix in 2006, my wife was scared. And she came to me on March 1st, the day she quit. She called me up at work on my day that I'm cleaning out my desk and everything. She says, I quit my job. In my head, I was screaming, do you know I'm unemployed too? I didn't say that to her, but we're sitting there watching TV. She comes over, she says, I'm scared. I don't know. What are we going to do? And I said, well, because I've been doing interviews like this since the early 80s. I said, with everything I've learned over the years, there's only one thing you can do. And that's what we're going to do. We're going to jump and we're going to trust. When you come to an edge, a cliff, metaphorically speaking, you jump and trust. And that's how I wound up here in Santa Barbara talking to you today. So the next step is, who knows? But every time that kind of adversity comes along, people do that. And to jump into your own business, maybe at that time, if you had any equity left in your home, you'd put that towards that, or maybe you were able to get a loan, a small one, to get your business started, whatever the process was.
Well, and Richard, it's so interesting because, when our family businesses got sold as a result of my dad and my brothers having a bit of turmoil in their a lot of turmoil in their relationship, I thought my life was coming to an end, because I was going to work in this company that Granddad started and my dad ran. But, Richard, I never would have had the privilege of becoming a professor at the university. I wouldn't have written 3 books. I wouldn't have had the opportunity to travel all around the world as a competitive water skier. There's a lot of things that I wouldn't have done that have been wonderful, that had I not had the adversity that came with the businesses all being sold. So I love your emphasis on trust and jump. So that's good.
Well, here's an interesting twist for the whole sequence. Been doing this for over 43 years. I started, believe it or not, in broadcasting. I could go back to working in the audiovisual department of Phoenix Community College for a few months while I was going to school. But my first job started on the 29th of August, 1979. I was 19 years old. And over the course of time, as I was doing that, I went to the state because I, of course, I was legally blind. And so I went to the state to take an aptitude test. I took it. I took the test. And the aptitude test said I should be a farmer. Well, there is a certain element of metaphorical truth in what I do today. But I'm not the one that's necessarily planting the seeds. I'm giving people such as yourself the opportunity to plant the seeds of knowledge and information and wisdom, hopefully into the minds and hearts of the listeners, so that it will grow within them and expand their consciousness, their awareness, their insight, their education, and so forth, so that they can make their lives better, and then subsequently the lives of the people around them through a lot of what we've talked about today.
Thanks for inviting me to your farm.
Now, will you please hook up the plow and pull?
Yeah.
David Bentall is my guest, and we're talking about his latest work in regards to the 9 character traits of leadership, Dear Younger Me, and the subtitle has to do with wisdom for a family enterprise successors, here on Tell Me Your Story. I'm Richard Dugan, your host on Tell Me Your Story, and we're talking with David Bentall. And David, first of all, I want to thank you not only for what you've shared with us here on the program, but also for being a part of what we're doing here in terms of trying to make this world a better place for everybody. This is not something that's exclusive to a certain class of people in America, let alone around the world, because we've got listeners with the podcasts all over the world. It astounds me sometimes some of the countries that are actually listening. India is number 2 on the list after the United States, which I find really fascinating. Unfortunately, Ireland, my heart's desire for living, comes in a sad 4th, but at least it's there in the running.
Yeah. And you might be you're probably very happy that, I played rugby all through high school and university. Ireland's now the number 1 ranked rugby nation in the world. So you must be proud of that.
Oh yeah. Hey, anything we can get, even if it's to raise a glass of Guinness at the local pub. Yeah. By the way, do you know where, it's sort of a joke riddle, do you know where the best Guinness is to drink?
Well, I think I'm going to be the straight man. No, tell me, Richard.
The only place where you're going to get the best tasting Guinness is in Ireland. Yes, they sell it in the States, but it's not the same.
Not the same.
It's just not the same.
I have been told that. I'd forgotten that. You're absolutely right. A friend of mine's family's from Ireland. He told me that. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's, again, and I will tell you, it's not because of the recipe's different. It's because of where you're drinking it. And who you're drinking it with.
Okay.
Yeah, a local constabulary. Very good. Well, I have 3 final questions that I would like to ask you, that I ask all of my guests. And over the last 15 years, we've sort of changed them up a little bit. And I will ask you those in just a moment. But first, I want to thank you for listening to and watching Tell Me Your Story. New paradigms for a new world, as we're giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. We are here on Sundays at 7 a.m. and 7 p.m., Monday mornings at 1 a.m., and Wednesdays at 9 a.m. for a special edition of Tell Me Your Story. We stream live at those times at richarddugan.com. We have the podcasts on SoundCloud, iTunes, TuneIn Radio, Spotify, Stitcher, Player FM, Blueberry. Oh my goodness, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music, and many other locations on the internet. And I thank those who have been reposting the interviews on the various platforms. I really appreciate that. We also ask that you spend some time going within and listening to that still small voice. When I get to this part, David, I then think, you know what? we never touched on intuition in regards to this whole thing, in regards to the character traits and so forth. But that's just a good reason to have you back for another program. But we want you to spend some time going within during this, the decade of perfect vision, where you listen to that still small voice and follow the promptings. It's not going to hurt you, I promise. We also ask that if you can support the work that we are doing here at Tell Me Your Story, we would greatly appreciate that. We have a PayPal account. It's there for your security as well as ours. And when you go there, you will be asked to put an email address in to whom to send it to, and it would be richard@richarddugan.com. That's richard@richarddugan.com. And with all of that being said, we go to our final three questions. And the first of those is, who is David Bentall?
Well, thanks, Richard. It's really interesting. Who is David Bentall is not a question that you'd think that I'd have thought about very much, but I actually thought about it a lot, because David Bentall is a man who likes to be like his grandfather. My last name is Bentall, and my grandfather was a man of integrity, so I try and be like him. And my dad, Clark, my middle name is Clark, and my dad was a visionary, and I want to be like my dad, to be a visionary. And who's David? The Bible says David was a man after God's own heart. So I seek to be a man after God's own heart, who's visionary and seeks to help families by leading with integrity. So that's just you touched a very personal note there for me. So that's who I am, David Clark Bentall.
Another similarity between you and I, by the way, is that my middle name is my father's first name.
Nice.
So nice. I thought that's pretty cool. Next question is, what is your life's purpose?
Well, it's interesting. I've thought about it. I first wrote a mission statement years ago, and I wanted to become a wise and joyful steward of the life and legacy I've been given. And it sounded pretty rote, right? But I was thinking about what my dad had done, my grandpa had done. So I wanted to be a wise steward of the life and legacy I'd been given. But as I've thought about it more, maybe, but I thought about it a lot. And I've decided, Richard, that my mission for my life, my vision for my life, is that I would do one thing, and that I'd be a reflection of God's love. And I want to do that in my relationships with you, and we're talking. I want to be tender. I want to be kind. When I'm with my kids, my grandkids, with my clients, I want to reflect God's love to those who I'm with. So that's my purpose.
And final question, and I preface it by saying I hope you get the movie reference. What was your best day?
Oh gosh, the one I'd like to repeat like Groundhog Day over and over again. I think my best day was probably the day that I spent with our grandson this past summer. We were on our boat, and he cuddled up beside me on the front deck. And I turned to him and I said, how you doing, James? And he said, this is the best trip ever, Grandpa. And I said, tell me a little about what you love. I didn't want to say what you love about this trip, because I thought that'd be about me. I said, what are some things that you love? Hoping he might talk about the trip. And he's very keen about trains. And so he's had trains on the boat so he could play with his wooden trains. And he also loves, his favorite movie, because he loves trains, is the Polar Express. And I said, so James, what are three things you love? And he said, Grandpa, three things I love. I love Jesus, I love trains, and I love the Polar Bear Express. And I said, James, those are three really good things to love. And I'll leave our listeners guessing, but he asked me after that, Grandpa, and I told him those are three good things to love. He said, Grandpa, what are three things that you love? And I'll just keep that between me and my grandson. But the day that our grandson opened up to me and shared what mattered to him, we had that tender moment. I think that was one of my best days ever.
That's beautiful. That is beautiful. I had just watched City Slickers before I went on this trip with some buddies of mine, and we took this boat that I had assisted in refurbishing because it had a hole in the bottom, fiberglass boat, just a little rowboat. And I was all by myself up at the lake, and I had no transportation. I was literally stuck because one of the guys had gone back down to the city for some medical tests. I said, you know what? This is not going to be a total loss. So I got some breakfast, cleaned up the place, and I said, I'm taking that boat out on the lake. I helped to refurbish it, doggone it.
Yeah, of
And I
course.
rode up and down the lake. And then I got it back up on the shore, and I went back to the camp, and I lit this big old fire for one hot dog.
Yeah.
Then the other guy, was going to be three of us up there. The other guy showed up, and he brought this big pot, and we started heating up beans and a bone-in ham stuck in the beans to cook.
Yeah. Yeah.
Then he pulled out, we had beer, and then he brought out this bottle of Jack Daniels. And so we're sitting there drinking Jack Daniels and chasing it with beer, and we're just sitting there talking. And
cooking the ham in the beans.
Cooking the ham and the beans. And I was able to say that was my best day. And for the next 30 days, that happened to be Labor Day weekend in 1993. And for the next 30 days, each day after that, I could say, wow, this is my best day. Over and over again. It was so fabulous. And I've had some since then. And I thought, boy, what a great question to ask the guest. What was your best day? Because I loved that scene in the movie where they're riding and they're asking that question of each other. And everybody's is different. And I've had guests on multiple times since I started asking that. Sometimes
always have a different. Yeah.
But it's
well,
great.
And Richard, it touches to what matters so much for us to cultivate this gratitude, right? To take a moment. My sister, every morning, she lists the 3 things she's grateful for that morning as she has her coffee, and I've learned from her to do that every morning. And we need to pause and be grateful for what we have.
Be grateful, absolutely.
Even if it's just one hot dog over the fire.
I really had to laugh at myself at that time because I mean it was a big roaring fire.
Yeah.
You know. but it was such a blast and so I can't oh, by the way, speaking of that camping trip, because it was so cold and then it started raining, what we did was with the fire we had at the time, we put rocks in the fire to heat them up. And then we made the mistake, thinking this was a good idea, of wrapping the rocks post-fire in newspaper, not thinking
what that
would catch the paper on fire. We then, of course, resorted to a wet cloth, and we put it inside my tent. I just had a little pup tent, and it was just me in the tent. And it started raining inside the tent.
Oh boy!
But
remind me to never go camping with you.
There you go.
Your best day ever.
Well, David, once again, thank you so much for being with us here on the program and helping me to reminisce a little bit and laugh as well. It's very important for us to keep doing that as well. And if you want the other 3 of the 9 character traits for leadership, you're going to have to go to his website, pick up a copy of Dear Younger Me. David Bentall, my guest, and you have been listening to Tell Me Your Story. You've also been watching it. And this has been a program about new paradigms for a new world, giving you choices and knowledge of those choices to help make your dreams come true. And until our next broadcast, podcast, videocast, love to Lal and Jeanette, I am listening.